guys, and welcome back to Dino Reacts. So guys, with a brand new decade, I wanted to look back at some of the horror movies I've loved in previous decades. So with this series, we're going to go through multiple different decades, and I'm just going to give you guys my top 10 horror movies of each one. Right now guys, we're going to start back at the 1970s, which has some great horror movies already. A lot of them, they have stood the test of time and are pretty much well known 40 years later. Before we jump straight in guys, remember these are just my top 10 horror movies. If you have a completely different ranking, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget guys, subscribe to the channel if you like what you're seeing, and if you want to get notified when a new video comes out, pop on that notification bell. But guys, let's jump straight in. Coming in at number 10 is The Wickerman, released in 1973. Now, The Wickerman is by far one of the biggest cult classics we have in horror, particularly because of that kind of twist, shocking ending. One thing I will say about this movie guys is when you watch it and you see that last act of the movie, it is something that will stay with you after you watch the film. The film itself has some standout performances, particularly from Christopher Lee in one of the most well-known roles he's had in his career, as well as Edward Woodward, who plays the detective who essentially is investigating the disappearance of a little girl on a remote Scottish island. Bit by bit, as he talks to the locals, he starts to realise that things aren't as they seem. The movie itself, it is definitely a slow burn movie, but as the film progresses, as we see more and more that is actually happening, what the motives of the locals are, it does get very, very sinister. And I will say the ending of this movie, it is definitely one that sticks with you. It's quite disturbing, it's quite dark, and it's one you won't forget anytime soon. Taking the number 9 spot is The Last House on the Left, which was released in 1972. Now, just like the last one on this list, this is quite a disturbing movie. It is quite raw, it's very, very brutal, and it also will stay with you. The film itself, it centers around two young girls who go missing. They're tortured, raped, and murdered by 3 criminals. Scenes of the rapes, of the murders, they are really, really graphic. This movie, it was directed by Wes Craven, which is surprising because movies after this, he didn't have the same kind of format. Now, what I will say guys is this one, although it is brutal, although it is quite dark, it hits an emotion that you don't get from a lot of other movies. When you see what these teenagers really go through, it is a stark reminder of how dangerous people can be in the world. As the movie progresses, the 3 criminals do end up in the parents' house of one of the teenagers they have just murdered. And the whole movie turns into a bit of a revenge movie after that. So although that first half is quite hard to watch, the second half is quite brutal. It's just as gory, but it's easier to watch because you see the criminals get what was coming to them. Making the number 8 spot is Black Christmas, which was released in 1974. Now, I've said in a previous ranking, this movie does not get enough credit, especially in the slasher genre. A lot of people look at Halloween as starting the whole slasher craze, but Black Christmas was the one that started Halloween off. It's pretty much well known that John Carpenter had actually talked to the director of Black Christmas and asked him would he make a sequel. The director had given him a few notes about what he would do. He actually had said he would base it on Halloween, and John Carpenter's idea developed from there. This movie is definitely the first of its kind. It's kind of the first real slasher movie besides Psycho that we get. Now, what I will say guys is this movie also does not get enough credit about the serious matters it actually goes through. We have a group of girls in this movie, and they're not the typical girls you would get in slasher genre. I do also find the movie goes into a lot of different issues that happen to women in their day-to-day lives, and the whole film kind of culminates in you guessing which male character is actually the killer. The film itself, it is dark, it is quite brutal, but it's not the goriest one out there. It's a great slasher film if you kind of want to see where it started from. But for me guys, this is always a movie that I will go to every Christmas. I tend to watch this or the remake, I go back and forth every year with them. But the original does stand the test of time. It's still a great movie today. The directing in this one is also quite good. We get those great POV shots, we get great characters, and they're interesting characters that kind of push back against the police protection. Coming in at number 7 is The Omen from 1976. This one guys has always been a favourite of mine. I've watched this movie countless times. Now, one of the reasons this was such a huge movie in the 70s was because of its religious undertones. Now this one instead concerns the Antichrist, and especially in the 1970s, this one's really delved into a lot of people's real life fears of the Antichrist and what that would mean. The movie, I will say as well, gives Final Destination a run for its money. It has some great death scenes that still hold up today. The movie is quite shocking in the different directions it takes, especially the ending of the movie. Again, if you haven't seen this one, guys, throw it on. Try to avoid a remake if you can. It's pretty much a shot for shot remake for the most part. If you want to see the old one, if you want to see the classic, the one that kind of started the whole little boy killer craze, check this one out. Hitting the number 6 spot is Dawn of the Dead from 1978. So guys, this one is pretty much considered to be the greatest zombie film of all time, and you can tell why when you watch it. After Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero went bigger, bolder and better pretty much with the sequel. So he actually took it from the kind of farmland, small community of the first movie and brought it into a big, huge shopping centre right in the middle of the city. We follow a group of survivors just pretty much just trying to survive in this shopping centre, trying to figure out what the world has become and will they be saved. Now, as well as that, the special effects are done by Tom Savini in this movie, and they are by far some of the best special effects we'd seen in horror up until that point. I will say kind of what came after this did not live up to this movie. This is still by far the best in the series, and that is why it makes my number 6 spot. Coming in at number 5 is Carrie from 1976. The film itself was directed beautifully by Brian De Palma. It stars Sissy Spacek as the title role of Carrie. With school bullying, with school shootings today, this movie is still extremely relevant. With the character of Carrie, you don't really see her as a villain in this movie. Throughout the whole film, you do root for her character, you care for her character, and that's why it is so shocking that at the end of the movie she goes batshit crazy and just kills everyone in her way. That last third act of the movie, the entire school massacre, it hasn't really been topped since that movie came out. There's been a couple of remakes where again they've tried to do the same thing, but it just doesn't have that same feeling that Brian De Palma gave to the original. If you want to see a great novel to film adaptation, especially in the horror genre, Carrie is the one to see. Sissy Spacek gives an amazing performance in this movie, which you can see with the awards she got for this. Taking over the number 4 spot is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was released in 1974. So it centers around a group of teenagers who were tortured, murdered and dismembered by the Sawyer family. This one, guys, it is of course a classic in the horror genre. It gave us the birth of Leatherface. The way this movie is shot, the way it is made by Tobe Hooper, it does give you a sense that you are there with these characters. Everything has a very visceral, real feeling to it. You feel like you could touch the objects with this film. And that's the same kind of for the deaths for the most part. Some of the death scenes in this have not aged as well, but overall, especially that last third act of the movie, it is all out carnage, it is all out gore and blood. The Sawyer family as well are a group of villains that still to this day have not been matched. They are terrifying and sadistic in ways that you don't see in horror movies today. Of course, when this movie was released, there was a huge myth that the film was based on real life events. Still though, the movie holds up today. I will watch this movie countless times. I will say the remake definitely gives it a run for its money, but for me, especially in the 70s, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the best movies we got in that decade. Next up, taking the number 3 spot is The Exorcist from 1973. Now, most people will know The Exorcist pretty much changed the face of horror. It is one of the most famous horror movies of all time. At the time of its release, people were reported as fainting, getting sick and just passing out in cinemas throughout the US.
I ain't never took my coat and hooked it over my face like that.
I thought it was very powerful. Just turned my mind.
Terrible. But I just found it really horrible and just had to come out. I couldn't take it anymore.
People are extremely depressed by this.
A lot of that was probably to do with how influential the Catholic Church was in the US at that time, as well as word of mouth. So the film itself had a notorious backlash from Christian groups, which of course just made teenagers, young adults and anyone in between want to go see it a lot more. People did get sick. There are videos and interviews of people being really upset watching this movie, and at the same time you can tell why. When you watch this film, it is quite disturbing. It is very dark. A lot happens in this movie, but it happens bit by bit. It is a bit of a slow burn, but when those events happen, they do leave an impact on you. The film is also kind of shot in almost a stage show setting, so as you watch it, as you grow accustomed to these characters, you do really care for them. When these kind of supernatural satanic elements come into the movie, you do want these characters to be okay, and it just kind of heightens the tension and the suspense of the entire film. Alright guys, we are down to our last two. Before we do that guys, I am going to give some honorable mentions. One is Jaws. A lot of people would not consider this a horror movie, but for me, any movie that pretty much convinces an entire generation not to swim in the sea is a horror movie. The other one is Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978. That for me guys, I'm a huge fan of pod movies. I really enjoy that one. I think it's the best remake we've had of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It hasn't really been outdone yet. Donald Sutherland is in that movie and he gives a great performance with Jeff Goldblum. That's a movie that really I wanted to throw on here on my top 10. I just didn't have enough room for it, but it is one you should check out if you haven't seen it already. Okay, back to our ranking, and taking the number 2 spot is Ridley Scott's Alien from 1979. Now for me guys, this is by far the greatest sci-fi horror we've ever got. Now again, some people do not for some reason consider this a horror movie. For me, it's a horror movie in space, end of. We get the Xenomorph, who is by far one of the best villains we've ever gotten on screen. This movie came out in 1979 and I showed you what a kick-ass action hero could be. The film itself is beautifully shot. It still holds up to this day. When you watch this movie in HD or 4K today, it would look like a film that was made this year. As well as that, the set design all comes from the mind of H.R. Giger, who Ridley Scott, he designed all of these sets, but if you see them, they are all model scale sets. They look absolutely phenomenal, and nothing has really come like that. Even the movies today, a lot of the set designs, they are CGI. You know, they don't live up to what we got with Alien. The whole movie itself, it is a very claustrophobic movie. It is built around paranoia, especially as there's something on the ship that's slowly developing and evolving into the big ass Xenomorph. The movie itself is definitely built on tension. You get that through this whole movie. This is one Xenomorph that is hunting everyone down as the film goes on, and he's constantly kept in the darkness. When you do see him and you see his design, you will see immediately how iconic he looks, and he still holds up to that to this day. The Xenomorphs are one of the biggest villains we've ever had in horror, and for me, I just hope we get more Alien movies in the future. Now taking the number 1 spot is John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978. This should be no surprise if you know what I like. Halloween is pretty much my favourite movie of all time, so for the 70s it was going to make the top of this list. One of the reasons I absolutely love this movie is the simplicity of the story. You know, this doesn't have a huge plot. It's a very simple story of an escaped mental patient that goes back to his hometown and starts murdering babysitters. There are a lot of slasher movies that did come out over the next 2 decades because of this movie. But again, what I like is the simplicity, even down to the murderer himself, Michael Myers. His mask in this one, you know, it's a very simple mask. It's a normal face without any emotion on it. And that does play into people's fears, you know. As well as that, you take a small town America at the time in the late 70s, people were leaving their back doors open. They weren't really worrying about someone breaking into their house. This was also the time where there was a rise in serial killers in real life, so it played into those fears that people need to lock their doors, they need to lock their windows, and just consider that maybe somebody could be inside their house. And for me, when I watched that movie, especially when I was younger, that was the scariest aspect, that you could be in your house and there in the darkness somebody is there watching you. The movie is helped by the performances of Donald Pleasence and Jamie Lee Curtis. Both give phenomenal performances in this movie, especially Jamie Lee Curtis is pretty much the role that she will always be remembered for, and that's almost the same for Donald Pleasence. John Carpenter's team goes exceptionally well with this movie. It probably has made the movie more iconic because of that team. But all in all, guys, this is a great movie to top off the decade. You know, it came in right at the end and it just kind of gave us a taste of what the next decade would be like. The movie itself, it ends in a very ominous notion that Michael has not been captured, that he is still out there somewhere. And for me, that's a great way to end that decade, that things aren't really what they seem. Something big is coming, and we saw that with the slasher craze of the 80s. But guys, that's just my top 10 horror movies of the 1970s. Of course, guys, if you liked this video, comment and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you liked about it and let me know your personal rankings of the horror movies in the 1970s. Until next time, Heidi ho.